If you've bought a brand new set of brakes, or even bought a brand new bike with super powerful 4-pot calipers on there, it may be that you still feel like you're not getting enough power. And it's possible that buying a new set of brakes won't actually solve that. It could be that your pads, your discs, or even your bedding in process is holding them back from reaching their full potential. Now, I'm going to explain what burnishing discs is, how to bed in pads properly, and all the ins and outs of a disc that can help your brakes be more powerful. So if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and give us a big old thumbs up if you want more nerd level detail about tech like this in the future. Okay, now for all you regulars out there, I'm sure you follow the proper bedding in process. But I'll admit, when I first started riding bikes, I knew I needed to bed in new pads, but I didn't really know why or how that would affect the performance of my brakes. And what I've come to think of it like now is more of a pairing process rather than bedding in new pads, because you do need to bed in new discs as well. Now, the pairing process is because basically a new disc will actually have tiny little pores in that surface. And when you bed in new pads with that disc, you're depositing a tiny bit of that pad material onto the discs. And that fills those tiny little pores, and those materials will bind or grab. And that's what makes the braking performance better. If you had a clean disc, it wouldn't actually bind very well with a brand new pad, so it just wouldn't work very well. So for that reason, you do need to bed in new discs as well as new pads. We actually call that burnishing, and burnishing just means rubbing metal basically, but it's often used for talking about bedding in new discs. Now, when we start to think of this pairing process of new pads with new discs, it becomes easier to remember that actually if you change from pad material to another pad material, say you start with resin pads and then you decide that you want sintered pads, you're going to need a new set of discs, ideally. Now, this doesn't sound great from a wallet or a wastage point of view, but if we're talking about power here and optimal braking performance, then you're going to need a set of discs with tiny pores that are deposited with the correct material. So you'll see in a pro workshop that they'll have a set of discs labeled sintered, and they'll have a set of discs labeled resin, and they will only ever work the two with each other so that they bind and they pair properly. Now, if you imagine that you've got a pair of discs that you've used resin on, for example, and then you go ahead and change up to sintered, you could be pulling out that material or just glazing over the material, and they won't bind correctly. So for performance, we always pair discs with pads. Now, different manufacturers do have a preference on how to bed in new pads or new discs. So do check your manual or go online and find out what their process is for bedding in brakes, as that will be the optimum way of getting all of the power immediately when you're starting up with your new pads and your new discs. Or you can check out Doddy's video. I'll leave the link in the description below, where he goes over a general way of bedding in. But the idea is to do this gradually, to gradually deposit this material onto the disc. If you rush it, you could end up heating them up, say glazing them, which basically means you've created a shiny surface on the pad, and that won't grip. There won't be enough friction against the pad and the disc to create a good braking surface. Equally, you can actually glaze a disc. You can heat it up too much that you get a nice shiny surface with no pores that can take on the material from your pad. So that's not optimum either. So do the process properly and take your time. Don't rush it. Now, you may have the best brakes on your bike at the moment, and you may have even upgraded your pads to something a little high end, and maybe you're completely on point with your bedding in or your burnishing process. But if your discs are cheap in the outset, then you're not going to be getting the best performance or power from those brakes. In fact, some manufacturers will spec quite cheap discs on their bikes to save a bit of money, and it can be easily overlooked. I've definitely received bikes with quite flexible discs on there. Sometimes you'll even see resin only on an OEM disc. And what that is because it just wouldn't stand up to even a sintered pad, believe it or not. They could be so soft, and perhaps they've saved money by not heat treating them. They could be so soft that even the metal flakes in a pad would just simply chew them up, and that's why they're resin only. So I think the best analogy I can explain to drive this point forward is if you have experienced the difference between cheap tires, imagine something really cheap, OEM, plasticky, compared to a high-end tire that is super tacky, super grippy, all the bells and whistles. Imagine the difference in grip between those tires. And imagine if you weren't getting any grip in the corners, you wouldn't just go out and buy a new set of wheels to sort that out. You would change the tires. And for me, I feel like discs is the same thing. If you're not getting enough power from your brakes, start with your discs first. So there's two things that you really want from your discs. You want them to be strong so that they remain stiff and straight, so that your braking power is consistent the whole time that you're using them, or the whole descent that you're dragging your brakes down. You also want good cooling properties, and this stops your braking from fading as you go down a long descent, for example. As a disc or a pad heats up, the braking performance decreases, so that's why we want good cooling properties. Now, cooling properties come in different forms. There's a few things that you can do, from holes to rotors to materials. So I'm going to go into each of these in a lot more detail now. Okay, let's talk about size, because this is probably the first thing you'll be thinking of when you go out and buy a brand new set of rotors. Now, bigger means more power. The reason for that is because there's more surface area. The bigger means more torque on the wheel, so you'll get more sort of strength and power out of your brakes. Now, bigger doesn't always mean better. Having more torque or more power through the wheel could be too much for your style of riding or even your genre of riding. Something that Doddy learned when he was testing out 220 versus 200mm versus 180mm discs when he was doing a Magura test in Spain. He didn't actually like the 220 because it felt a bit more like a light switch. But you might get on with it. That might be better for you. If you're riding XC, XC tends to be more in the realms of 160 to 180. You possibly don't need as much braking power because of the lighter bike, and you might actually want to be saving weight instead of getting more power, for example. Trail tends to be somewhere in the middle with a 180 to 200. Enduro and all mountain tends to be 200 to 220. And you'll see e-bikes with 220s as well a lot at the moment. The benefit of those bigger discs, as well as the torque that it provides, is that there's more surface area to cool down or to keep it cool or prevent it from heating up, which means more consistent braking on those long descents. Just a quick word on thickness here. You might see companies like SRAM, they will up the thickness level of their rotors as the size increases. And that's not necessarily a performance thing, I would say personally. It's more that as a disc gets bigger, it becomes easier to be bendy or flexible, so they need to up the thickness to match the rigidity of something a little smaller. So the big difference between the two that I'm holding up here is that this is a one piece and this kind of has a little spider in the center. And we call these floating rotors. And this effectively allows the rotor braking surface, which is made out of steel here, to be mounted to something that is made out of aluminium. And the reason that they do this is because they just want to make a thicker center so that the disc is more likely to stay straight and not become flexible, because it's going back to that strength means more consistent braking power. And making it out of aluminium is just because it keeps the weight down. If we made something like this out of steel, it would be quite heavy. Now, if you're an XC racer, you might want to stick with this, that's fine, but you can get floating rotors like this as well. And they keep the weight down by having less arms or spiders, and they'll often be a direct mount in order to keep the weight down as well. The holes in your discs will affect your braking performance as well, but it's a bit of a balancing act, I would say. With this here, we've got a lot of holes. This is more of an XC disc, and the holes will keep the weight down, but it'll also keep it cooler as well. Although on the flip side, having more holes in your discs means less braking surface. And although that would mean cooler, it will mean that the braking performance could be not as good as more surface, but certainly there's not enough surface to have those pores and then deposit resin, and you can see where the balancing act comes from keeping your discs cool to having enough surface area to actually grab and bind with the pads. Another problem with having a lot of holes is that it can actually chew up pads quite easily. So if your XC and light and airy is what you're going for, then fine, but you will have to consider that you might need to replace your pads on a regular basis. In the world of trail, we tend to go for a decent surface area for more braking surface, more power, and the heat dissipation technology has come on so far with things like fins and sandwiching materials, which I'll go into a bit later, that we don't need to worry too much about putting loads and loads of holes in these kinds of discs. In fact, the other end of the scale is I've heard of some cyclocross discs that have no holes in them whatsoever. Now, as a generally winter sport, they wouldn't need to cool down their brakes so much in the winter to keep their performance, and so they've gone for a bigger surface area. And in fact, having more surface area and having the ability to warm up your pads more in the winter means that they're actually going to be able to burn off those puddle splashes and the dirt that hits them and keep the performance up that way. And in fact, that might be something you need to consider in the winter, is having more surface area or even a smaller disc so that it does warm up and it does dissipate the dirt and the mud and the puddle splashes in the winter. Okay, let's talk about materials, because that alone can change the strength factor and the heat cooling properties of your disc, regardless of its shape, size, or the holes that are available to it. Now, aluminium is great for dissipating heat, which you would think is what we would want, and it's nice and light too, but it's also really, really soft, so it just wouldn't last so well on something that's as thin as 2 mils. We also see a lot of steel being used, iron, certainly in the automotive disc braking world, because it's got great heat dissipating properties. But we don't see it in discs. We tend to use stainless steel, which isn't as good for heat, but the factors that benefit it far outweigh the heat dissipation qualities, because if you were to have just normal steel, carbon steel, then it would just almost certainly rust under any kind of moisture, even the moisture in the air. And for something that is, 2 mil thick, the corrosion damaging properties on that would just be too much. It just far outweighs. You don't want to resurface your discs and your pads every time you ride your bike. So it's always stainless steel. Now, the other materials do get used elsewhere. We've got some aluminium obviously used in a floating rotor to keep the weight down, but it's not used in the braking surface. Also, Shimano tend to use a kind of a sandwich in their ice technology. So it will be steel on the outside and aluminium on the center. And this is so that they have that hard braking surface on the outside, but that aluminium tends to, well, is expected to draw the heat out and dissipate it into the air. They've also taken it one step further with the freezers, with these fins here. This internal aluminium sandwich comes out into the fins, so it draws the heat from the disc to the fins and also gets the added cooling properties of the air being drawn in from the fins. So that's why they're supposed to be better for cooling down and having consistent braking when you're using your brakes, say on a really long alpine descent. And I certainly do notice that difference, and I'm not a super fast heavy rider. And then you've got the XTR freezer technology, which has this added heat dissipating paint here, something that SRAM uses as well, which is said to save degrees of heat in long braking distance. So if power is your absolute need for your bike, certainly in trail and enduro, or if you're doing long descents, then do consider fins, uses of aluminium, and even this heat dissipating paint as well. So let's briefly and finally touch on steel grading. As you'll see when you start to purchase discs, certainly XC discs often try and boast that they're using something like a 410 grade stainless steel. And I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but basically a stainless steel in the 400 series means it can be heat treated to a higher temperature to make it stronger than something in, for example, a 300 series. So if you see a disc that says it's 410 stainless steel, as opposed to, for example, a 304 steel or something like that, it just basically is trying to boast that it is stronger from a heat treatment. The counter side is thinking again about those OEM super flexible non-heat treated discs that may be the same width, but they're certainly not the same strength, and that will affect your performance. Now, it should go without saying that maintenance will keep the power in your brakes and in your discs. So one thing to note is that disc widths, there's usually a minimum on there for them to perform optimally. So often you'll see written on here, like I've got a minimum thickness, or TH equals 1.5. So that means your disc thickness must be a minimum 1.5 in order to perform at their best. So if you're a tool monster, you might want to get yourself a digital caliper like this so that you can properly measure the width of your discs on a regular basis. And certainly you want to get a ruler, like a metal ruler, that you can drop onto a pad and measure the pad, because there's a minimum thickness on your pads as well. So keep on top of thicknesses of pads and discs, and also inspect them regularly for damage. It should go without saying, but what you're looking for is an overly shiny surface on either. You can actually see pads catch in the light if you've glazed them, you've got them too hot perhaps on a descent, or you not bedded them in properly and got them too hot too quick. Same will happen with your discs. You can get them too hot too quick. In fact, this one, definitely this road disc got too hot too quick, and you can see that it's actually started to have a bobbling effect where the material is melting away. So do keep an eye on your discs for changes like that, scratches, scores. If you get any of these multicolored changes, multicolored tones or blacknesses, that again is from scorching. And generally, if optimal performance and power is what you're looking for here, then you need to just get rid of these. It is possible you can resurface them if you're comfortable with that. Otherwise, you may be looking at a new disc, a new set of pads altogether. And then, of course, there's contamination. Something I've been doing for this entire time of this video is touching disc pads, or getting lubricant on your disc pads, or cleaning your bike, not covering your discs, and accidentally spraying chain gunk all over your discs. That will contaminate the disc and it just won't work so well. And if you consider, as we've talked about, that discs have tiny pores with bits of resin or sintered pad material in there, once you've contaminated that, I mean, you can resurface it, but it's very unlikely you're gonna get rid of it. So it might be time to consider replacing them if you have contaminated your discs. Now, these discs, these are all burnt and damaged, so I'm happy to touch them. But if you're doing maintenance on your discs, always wear some nitrile gloves like these to make sure that even the oils on your fingers, even if you have clean hands, don't contaminate that disc. And of course, it should go without saying that you should be bleeding your brakes regularly. Air in the system needs to come out so that you have good braking performance, obviously. But over time, even mineral oil will start to degrade. You'll know because it will start to change color. It will start to go a bit black, and that's a sure sign that you need to change that fluid. And then there's dot fluid. Now, this fluid is hygroscopic, which means it'll actually absorb water. Now, this could be through tiny holes and pores in your braking system or your hoses, or it could just be the moisture in the air when the system is open. So this means you'll have to bleed your brakes regularly, certainly biannually, annually at the very worst. And even if you open a dot fluid container, that would have to be replaced after, I would say, 6 months. So that's it from me, nerd level discs, and hopefully I've gone full nerd on you and you've learned 1 or 2 things. Let me know what you've learned down in the comments below, and if I've missed anything, then do tell me. Is there any nerd level details that you go to when you look at brakes or discs or pads? Share it down in the comments below and help out the GMBN community.